Hello, everyone. Welcome to the annual UCLA Global Conversation. I'm Cindy Fan, UCLA's Vice Provost for International Studies and Global Engagement. As a land-grant institution, the International Institute at UCLA acknowledges the Gabrielino Tonga peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tauranga. The Global Conversation is part of International Education Week, or IEW, at UCLA. And I'm delighted to have Vice Chancellor Anna Spain-Bradley as our speaker today. Since 2016, IEW at UCLA has been a campus initiative led by the International Institute and its organizing partners, the Dashu Center for International Students and Scholars, UCLA Library, Office of Residential Life, and Study Abroad Office. Now, some of you may be wondering or even questioning why we should commemorate such an occasion during this challenging time. When the pandemic has impeded universities' ability to sustain international exchange and collaboration and hampered students' plans to study or conduct research abroad, and when tightened visa regulations have made it difficult for international students and visiting scholars to travel to the United States. In fact, the team that organizes IEW at UCLA each year also discussed this question. And we concluded that international education and exchange are more important now than ever. If the pandemic has shown us anything, it is how interconnected the world of the 21st century is. The impacts of COVID-19 are global, and the pandemic itself is one of many challenges today whose resolutions will require global collaboration. We also want to affirm and reaffirm our solidarity with our international community. We consider the contributions of international students, scholars, and researchers, and the ability of our students to participate in education, research, and internship programs abroad, an invaluable part of US higher education. Well, I guess the IEW team is not alone in believing in international education. There are 50 IEW events, webinars, and activities at UCLA this week, organized by schools, divisions, and units across the entire campus, not to mention the many articles, recorded videos, and resources that you can find on the IEW website. So I encourage you all to visit the website, global.ucla.edu/IEW, to learn more. And thank you to everyone who has contributed to IEW activities this year. And I also like to welcome UCLA leadership, faculty, staff, and students, colleagues from other universities and educational institutions, our alumni, friends, and community partners, including those in overseas locations, to attend this webinar today. And I'd like to extend my thanks to our organizing partners, as well as Elizabeth Lester, Christine Larson, Peggy McInerney, Catherine Paul, Jamaica Villegas, Kevin Wilbanks, Chloe Huga, and our IT team, Kaya Mentezulu, Oliver Chian, Leo Tuati, Alex Zhu, and Warren Berkey for helping to make this webinar possible. And before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. This global conversation is scheduled to run for approximately 1 hour. And after Vice Chancellor Spain-Bradley gives her remarks, she and I will have a brief discussion before she would take questions from the audience. At any time during the webinar, you are welcome to submit questions using the Q&A feature on the Zoom control panel. As time allows, Anna will address your questions during the Q&A. And we are recording this webinar and will share the link after the event. It is now my pleasure to give a brief introduction to Vice Chancellor Anna Spain-Bradley, who will share with us on the topic, Global Racism and the Role of Education. Anna Spain-Bradley became Vice Chancellor for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at UCLA on September 1, 2020. So if my math is correct, Anna, today is the 79th day you're in this position, and we're so happy. She serves as UCLA's senior campus official responsible for leading and implementing measures to promote an inclusive and equitable campus environment for all students, staff, faculty, alumni, and community partners. An expert in international law and human rights, Vice Chancellor Spain-Bradley's current research imagines global mechanisms to address racism and promote human rights. She serves as a legal expert to the United Nations on these matters and is the author of Global Racism and Human Choice in International Law, in addition to numerous other scholarly publications. Prior to taking the Vice Chancellor position at UCLA, she served as Assistant Vice Provost for Faculty Development and Diversity and a Professor of Law at the University of Colorado. And Anna is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and member of the American Society of International Law, and sits on the American Council of the Institute for Transnational Arbitration. In 2018, she was one of 4 educators in the nation to receive the Aussie Educator Award. And she earned her JD from Harvard Law School and her BA from Denison University. And I have to mention that she was affiliated with the International Institute at UCLA before she joined the University of Colorado. So welcome back, and thank you for being our speaker today, Anna.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much, Cindy, for the warm introduction, and welcome back to UCLA and to the International Institute in particular. It is an honor to participate in this year's global conversation, and I wish to thank Vice Provost Van and Christine Larson and all at the International Institute for the invitation. I also want to welcome all of our guests this evening. You are tuning in from across the campus at UCLA, within Los Angeles and the broader community, from the nation and beyond. And I cannot see you, but I deeply appreciate your attendance tonight. I also want to welcome all those who are joining in because of the topic of today's conversation, which is global racism and the role of education. My remarks on this topic tonight are my own. I am not speaking on behalf of UCLA, and they go to my experiences as a legal scholar and as a UN human rights advocate and as a human being with racism. Now, I just want to turn to my first slide. And I'll proceed. If you can see this, you'll see that these are the books that made the New York Times bestselling nonfiction list over the summer. And here, you might recognize some of the titles. Maybe you perhaps purchased some of them. Maybe you even read some of them. So let's go to the next slide. They have something in common. They deal with questions of race, racial discrimination, and racism. Underneath that, they deal with the common call that we all have as people to be treated inherently with dignity. Now, why did these books hit the New York Times bestseller list this summer? It is no secret that this year in 2020, people in the United States and beyond took renewed notice of the old problem of racism, particularly after the murder of George Floyd Jr., who was 46 years old, and it was documented horrifically on video, and that which had followed the loss of Sandra Bland, Trayvon Martin, and far too many more. Black Lives Matter became a rallying cry for change. Part of the change is to combat racism in all of its forms, which continues to harm millions of people in the world today, as it has for so long throughout human history. People who are mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, loved ones and friends, have been killed, murdered, locked up, spat on, called unthinkable names, rejected from jobs, denied mortgages, humiliated, and treated as being less than human because of the ill of racism. Now, reading is an essential part of self-discovery and of education, and it should always be encouraged. But we cannot read our way to eliminating racism. It is a starting point, not the ending one. Tonight, I want to present to you some remarks on how racism is a global problem, why that frame of understanding, I believe, is essential to reaching meaningful interventions, of which education is an important part. To start, let's return to the early 1960s and the next slide. We were at the peak of the civil rights movement in the United States, zenith, and many nations in Africa and elsewhere claimed independence from a colonial rule. Just 2 decades had passed after the end of World War II. the beginning of the United Nations, and the advent of universal human rights, starting with the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. If we go to the next slide, here we have an image depicting this moment in 1965, where nations from around the world had finally agreed to the final text of a treaty called the International Convention of the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, ICERD for short, that prohibited racial discrimination in all of its forms. It consists of 25 articles, and in the next slide we'll see in Article 1.1, it defines racial discrimination as any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin, which has the purpose or effect of nullifying or impairing the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal footing of human rights and fundamental freedoms, and so forth. This definition is long, it is wordy, and that's what happens when you get a large group of people, let alone a large group of nations together, and ask them to negotiate and reach an agreement on a definition. Moreover, the definition here set up this idea, this concept, that the harm was one defined as racial discrimination, discrimination linked to an act. It could be a distinction, an exclusion, a restriction, or a preference that's connected to a person's race, variously defined. Thus, under international law, the prohibition is discrimination on the basis of race, color, ethnicity, without any further clarity about what that means. But here we recall another document that preceded this one. 1950, the UN group UNESCO issued a report famously called The Race Question. And in that report, for the first time on the global stage, nations agreed and were put on notice that race was man-made. That was the language of the time. It was a concept that had no basis in science or biology. In 1950, there were still questions about that. And this report out of the UN UNESCO group put such questions to rest. But despite documents like that report and this treaty, nations' track record in eliminating racial discrimination has not matched their intent. Governments around the world struggle to meaningfully address racial discrimination. The United States offers a sad example, where despite anti-discrimination laws and equal protection rights, the government has failed to protect its people from various forms of racism. Police continue to racially profile and murder African Americans and others at alarming rates, prompting public outcry, but little remedy. Law enforcement efforts to curb rape and sexual assault have failed to protect Alaska Native women who experience disproportionately high rates of sexual crimes and murder. People of Latinx descent report encountering discrimination by landlords and employers in their efforts to rent homes or interview for jobs. And a recent poll reports that 37% have been the target of racial slurs. Islamophobia against Muslims persists across racial groups. And in June of 2018, the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, documented the rise in racially motivated hate crimes in America. In New York City, hate crimes against Jewish people were up by approximately 6% in 2018 alone. Racist motivated voter suppression, race-baiting speech by politicians, pro-Nazi symbols have experienced a resurgence. And notably, since 2016 and since the election of Donald Trump as president, 60% of Americans at least report that they believe race relations are worse. Of course, racism is not isolated to America. It harms people around the world. Widespread accounts of racism documented by the United Nations human rights groups evidence the rise of racist speech and incitement to violence against the Igbo people in Nigeria, the killing of 60 human rights defenders, many who were engaged in the fight against racial discrimination, in monitoring the situation of indigenous peoples in the Philippines, and the fact that Black men from sub-Saharan African countries were being sold as slaves in markets in Libya. All of this has urged action at the global level to recognize racism once again as a global problem with harms knowing no national boundaries. Solutions require reaching the global nature of racism. The challenge here, and something that I've worked hard to develop in my work as a scholar, in my publications, in my forthcoming book, is that we lack a global definition. Around the world, people disagree and governments continue to disagree. Courts struggle to define what exactly is racism and what is the full extent of its harms. I want us to go back to this moment where people representing their countries at the UN were trying to negotiate the meaning of racism. And they had a strong debate, some might even call it a disagreement. It captures where we struggle and where we continue to struggle today. There was disapproval that the treaty only referenced racial discrimination in, quote, some parts of the world, which gave plausible deniability to some governments to say racism isn't a problem in our country. The discussion then turned to various forms of racial discrimination. What was it? The representative from Jordan proposed a list. It could be understood as fascist, colonial, tribal, Zionist. Western states stressed, this is again back in 1963, 64, 65, that racial discrimination emanated from Nazi ideology and anti-Semitism. African nations and the USSR, then USSR, discussed racial discrimination as a component of colonialism and apartheid. Some thought that we should name it more specifically. It could be called anti-Semitism, Nazism, fascism. A representative from Saudi Arabia argued, quote, that there were countless isms which would have to be enumerated if any one of them was, end quote. Inquiring if anti-Semitism was best understood as religious intolerance, not racial, and raising the question of how the treaty should address that, the representative from Israel responded, quote, the Jewish people know exactly what anti-Semitism was, for it had too long been its victim, whether for racial, religious, or other reasons. To those who suffer from racial discrimination, qualifiers were not important, end quote. Representatives from many countries asserted that racial discrimination was either not present in their country or did not apply to their minorities or indigenous peoples. Ultimately, as you can see, the world only defined racial discrimination specifically in two forms. Next slide. Apartheid and segregation. A few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to serve as legal expert to the United Nations group. It's called the Ad Hoc Committee on the Elaboration of Complementary Standards, and its job is to help determine how to make this treaty more effective in the world today through the potential addition of a protocol. The conversation there returned to these moments we've had over the past several decades. What is racism? How do we understand it from wherever we are in the world, from whatever groups or whatever ways in which we identify? What is the full nature of its harms? How do we address that? The answer most often turned to legal solutions, making certain things prohibited under national law, and ultimately education. This brings me to the second turn of tonight's conversation. What then, next slide please, is the role of education in combating racism? There's an often assumption that racism occurs because people are unaware or ignorant, and therefore education is the answer, because if only they knew and understood the history, the theory, people's narratives, the suffering, they would change their minds, and their minds then would change their behavior. That can certainly be the case in some instances, but it's also true, as we've increasingly seen this year, that some people actually do believe that they are superior to other people on the basis of their identity, be it race, gender, sexual orientation, or more. Here, I want to refer to the late, great Derek Bell's work describing the unique pain that racism inflicts in his book, Faces at the Bottom of the Well. He says, quote, Black people are the magical faces at the bottom of society's well. Even the poorest whites, those who must live their lives only a few levels above, gain their self-esteem by gazing down on us, end quote. His words reconstruct a narrative of social hierarchy that is centered on the social construct of race. Everywhere in the world, human beings are often organized into some kind of a hierarchy. And when we look at who is at the top and who is at the bottom, we can see certain things in common. Those with the least power, historically or presently, those who are the most vulnerable, Those with the least opportunity to change society's economic, legal, political structures find themselves at the bottom. It is this hierarchy that is one of the ills of racism. Whether we understand it as superiority, supremacy, or other forms, the idea that people want to exist along a hierarchy and that governments continue to reinforce such hierarchies is part of the problem that understanding racism as a global phenomenon calls upon us to address. Here we have lots of resources. UCLA's own experts, Professor Cheryl Harris over at the law school, for example, has argued that whiteness becomes a form of property that has legal, social, and economic value in society. Another law school colleague, UN Special Rapporteur on Racism and Xenophobia, Tendai Achume, has made great strides in helping push forward practical solutions throughout the world on addressing racism. There's the Critical Race Theory School of Scholars, of which UCLA is home to many who've launched and perpetuated that field in wonderful ways. There's the Third World Approaches to International Law Scholars, including folks like Adrian Wing, Mikhail Matua, Anthony Angie, James Gatti, and other voices, including Catherine Powell, who continue to describe the ways in which law and other structures are not racially neutral and instead can work to uphold the very hierarchies that we would seek to undo. Education, therefore, becomes a part of learning about proper framing, about the histories, the stories, the work that's gone before, that many of the books on the New York Times bestseller list draw upon and elaborate upon. But there are deeper, older works, perhaps laying in a dusty library somewhere, worthy of reading once again. It also calls upon us, education, to understand what is the educational platform from which educators are working from, that tackles racism explicitly and with an openness to investigating all of its manifestations. Which brings us to question number 2, how can education actually eliminate racism? Next slide, please. We want to think here about how people identify and how our identities show up in an educational environment. Somebody's often said, kids don't learn from the teacher if they don't like them. And there's some truth to that, because learning is a relationship between those teaching and professing and those learning. And there has to be a respect for each other's identities and an understanding, an acceptance of those identities for that educational environment to ensue. It also deals with power imbalances in and out of the classroom. Who has power? What's the source of the power? Can we talk about that? Does balancing power help us with our educational mission? Finally, we need to re-embrace the core principle of all universal human rights, that people are inherently deserving of being treated with dignity. What does that look like? What does that feel like? Next and final slide. I think this turns to the question of, what does education do? There's enough evidence, some of my own research and many others in neuroscience and brain science and behavioral science, looking at how people's minds actually engage, what happens in our memories, how do we process fear in our amygdala, what kind of things that do we engage in that actually change our neural structures and result in changed thinking and changed behavior. Reading alone doesn't do enough. Our educational models, especially those that seek to combat racism, have to be active. They have to be experiential. We have to do things with others and others who offer different identities than we ourselves bring. And those experiences change our minds about biases that we know about and those that remain implicit. They change our memories about who we associate as being kind and good and who we are afraid of. And that goes back to opening up our ability to embrace people across all identities and backgrounds. Finally, I think educators in 2020 and beyond have a deeper responsibility to find ways to engage racism. And this is a personal question. For years as a law professor and educator, I would teach it in the classroom, and yet I could not bring myself to write about it as a scholar because it was too painful. It drew upon things that happened to me growing up in my early childhood, that I could not stand in front of a room of scholars and say, here's an experience or theory that I have, and be faced with the kind of engagement that can sometimes be really strict and feel that I could not get upset about that. It was just too painful. But that changed in 2016. It was an epiphany for me after the election about what responsibility I had to better engage in this. And from there, I wrote an article called Human Rights Racism, which led to this book project on global racism and much more. In 2020, the language is not just about racial discrimination, but racism. It's not just about what's being done, it's about who's doing it and why. It's about how people believe, what they believe and what they feel motivates what they say and what they do. It's about understanding the health impacts that racism causes to current and future generations. It's about returning to that global conversation and reinvigorating a global commitment to addressing and eliminating racism. And I just conclude with this. If you are not outraged by the prevalence of racism in today's world, consider the depths of its harms. There is something particularly inhumane and morally reprehensible and egregious about racism. Racism is a tool of oppression that has global reach. It works by dehumanizing individuals and communities, not only by denying their inherent equality and dignity, but doing so on the basis of a constructed category of race designed for the very purpose of separating humans into a hierarchy meant to permanently elevate some and suppress many. If it's true to be true that all of us are equal in dignity and rights, we cannot shy away from the hard and often uncomfortable work of addressing racism by its name in education and beyond. And I'm delighted to be a part of a conversation at the International Institute and at UCLA that takes up these conversations and engagement with deep seriousness. Thank you so much, and I look forward to our engagement in the questions.
Thank you so much, Anna, for giving such a powerful, succinct talk, and also really remind us the historical and global perspective that are so essential when we talk about racism. So I have a million questions for you, but to be fair, I'm just going to ask you maybe a couple of follow-up questions so that the audience can also participate. And just a reminder to those who are on the webinar now, who are tuning in, please submit your questions if you have any through the Q&A function of the panel, of the Zoom panel. So Anna, I was struck when you talk about all these definitions that we don't really have a global definition for racism, and that's a problem. But also, I think what you've done for us today is really to get us to think back to the very core, the very basic meaning of being a human being. And you're humanizing, of course, this conversation. So in that regard, it really affects everyone, every individual person. And you also mentioned education, and the article that you mentioned, Human Rights Racism, I had an opportunity to read it, before the webinar, when we were talking about preparing for this webinar. And I was also struck by the focus, the sort of the attention you gave to acts of racism where we find over the centuries where that happen in nations that are against their own people, but also against foreigners. So yes, education can play a role, but can you maybe share with us your thoughts about more specifically how international education can play a role to help dismantle racism?
Thank you, Cindy. And I know your own work and deep expertise in questions of human migration within countries and across borders raises a lot of these questions of what does it mean to be a human in today's world, and what does it take for governments to recognize our humanity? And so just to break down that question into two smaller parts, I think the first issue is, and here I draw from early experiences in my career where I had the opportunity to work in Zambia and to do human rights work in Zambia. What was happening there at that time were a lot of people were coming into the country from other countries and were being put in jail because they didn't have proper passports or documentation. The jails were overcrowded. They were meant for criminals a long time ago, and there was not capacity. There was no place to put somebody who was not a criminal, but it was in this situation. And as a human rights matter, it was a case in which, perhaps people who come from a variety of different ethnicities and histories and cultures and speak different languages would look at each other and say, my group is superior to your group, and here's how, and here's why, because of history and because of shared culture. And from the outside perspective, from the Western perspective, certainly, and not, and wrongfully, I should say, people would say, oh, well, isn't everybody the same race? In other words, if all of the people that I was working with came into the United States, they would be recognized as being people of African descent, people who would be identified in America as Black. And yet in Zambia, there were important distinctions. And so this raises that category of racism can be both by people from who, in an American context, would be one race against each other, but also within a different context where people identify differently, it's xenophobia, it's an outsider. It's somebody who's not in my group, who's coming from an out group, who I think is different and distinct from my kind of people. Both of those things have a core thing in common. They put people on a hierarchy where some people are at the top and others are at the bottom. And I think unpacking the true nature and insidious harm of racism is about unpacking these hierarchies. Why do we even have them? And how governments continue to perpetuate hierarchies, not because it serves a lot of interests that governments sometimes have of dividing and categorizing people.
Well, thank you, Anna. Let me follow up with hierarchy. This particular sort of notion of hierarchy. Do you think that human beings are able to do away with hierarchy?
It's a great question that I would invoke the experts at the International Institute in a broader dialogue, because I think it goes to how do we reach the question. I mean, if we look at evolutionary biology and we look at what we think we know, big caveat there, what we think we know about our early human ancestors, we get different stories. We find people like people who are living much as they did thousands of years ago, like people who identify as the Hasta people in Tanzania, who are very egalitarian. And again, caveat that that's what outside researchers say they are. I don't know if the Hasta people would describe it as such. And they're egalitarian without what traditional hierarchies. But then we see, if we go into other primate behavior in other forms, we see that hierarchies do exist. So I think both things are possible. And a lot of it goes to, are we protecting property? Are we staying still? Are we moving around, taking our resources with us? There's all these important questions. But even if we find that in today's modern, complex, global world, there's a place and a value of hierarchy to organize people, then we have to reconsider what the hierarchies are based on and who gets to decide and determine that. And I think that is a way forward to remove a lot of the old assumptions about why hierarchies were valuable and take away the idea that they can't be questioned when they very much should.
Great answer, Anna. And I know that, yes, this is not something that any researcher alone can fully address. So looking forward to continuing discussion with you on this and others. But we have a lot of questions coming in, so I'm going to give up my right to ask you more questions. So
Okay.
let's go to some of the questions being raised. This is a long question. If we can agree for a moment that Ralph Bunche, the name of the building where the International Institute is, was correct when he said that hearts are the strongest when they beat in response to noble ideals. Then my question is, does a noble ideal such as the beloved community, which Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. advanced as a global vision, hold any relevance today? And if so, do global institutions like UCLA, for example, have a responsibility to evoke it? It's a pretty long question.
It's a beautiful question, and whoever asked it clearly knows their history. I have such deep respect and admiration for Ralph Bunche. For those who don't know, Ralph Bunche was one of the very early African-American US diplomats to the UN. He was instrumental. He was there at the creation of the UN Declaration on Human Rights. He played an important role both out in front and often quietly behind the scenes from what we know of his biographies, in shaping the conversations at the United Nations. And just again, to footnote that there was a huge and hard debate that the UN Charter did not do anything close to what it should have to protect people from the discrimination that we call racism. And there was arguments about that. We had delegations from the United States going to the UN that include Dr. Du Bois and others involved in the early moments that led up to the US Civil Rights Movement. And Ralph Bunche played a role, and was, one of the reasons why we have a broader view, perhaps, in some of these documents than we would have without his presence. To turn to the important question, and this idea of beloved community. Of course, UCLA has a responsibility and moreover an opportunity to embrace the fullest version of what does it mean to understand human identity in all of its forms. What happens when people come together from across the world, from within all these different frames, intersectional and otherwise. We have different ages, different races, different cultures, different languages, different sexual expressions and orientations, different genders, and we come together. And even at UCLA, as I'm learning, having been here just a few months, we have important conversations that we have a responsibility to engage with each other about priorities, about how to understand the harms that impact different groups of people, and appreciate that they are different and distinct. And so, yes, there is a need for that and a continued need. And I think what strikes me about UCLA, and one of the reasons I was so delighted to return, when you have diversity in the way that UCLA does, and it's diversity in all of its forms and a global reach, you have an incredible opportunity to make the aims of inclusion and equity and dignity possible. But it's hard, because instead of dealing with people who might identify according to 7 different things, you're dealing with people who identify in 80 different ways. And that makes it both interesting and complex, but it's work that's worth engaging, and work that I think the campus is eager to engage and has been for a long time.
Thank you, and I couldn't agree with you more. I truly also believe that people can have more than one identity. Why are we just boxing ourselves into just one identity, right? So I'm trying to combine maybe 2 questions here, asked both having to do with maybe the current situation. One of the questions was, when it comes to combating racism, it has to be at the local level. And this attendee asked if you could comment on the defeat of Proposition 16 in the context of the interracial dynamics in the United States. I'm just going to read from the question here. I was surprised to read in an LA Times report this week that a good number of counties in California with very large Asian and Latinx population voted against affirmative action. What are we to make of the fact that opposition to a proposition that would have empowered at least the Latinx community would be opposed by that very community?
Okay, lots of great questions, and it's exciting. I mean, I really wish we were in person and we could, engage in what this is supposed to be, which is a conversation, see each other and hear each other. But I do deeply appreciate that people are actively participating in the chat. So thanks for the questions, and please keep them coming. So to the second question first. So on Proposition 16, I of course have been paying attention to this, and will be formally in my official role communicating something soon about it. But I think as somebody who has been impacted by affirmative action, who has engaged in this topic in my life, in my work, just speaking from that perspective, I guess I would say, I think there's a conversation that needs to be had, and people have had it and continue to try to have it, about who needs help and why. The history of affirmative action in this country, to go back to that, was completely needed because there were barriers to entry in education, in the workforce, and in so many other places because of racism and because of other forms of discrimination. So in other words, if we didn't have a problem of racism in the first place, we wouldn't have needed affirmative action. And so to say that for those people who say, oh, well, we don't need affirmative action in 2020, we need to engage that more deeply. Why not? Are the problems that affirmative action was originally created to solve no longer there? Have they shifted form? Is something different and better needed? What might we understand that to be? But it goes to the core, which is racism remains pervasive throughout the United States. There's government endorsed racism. There's racism that occurs between people. There's institutional and structural racism. There's racism that occurs in law and in our economic spaces, socially, culturally, politically. That has not gone away. And the need to make sure that institutions of higher learning can afford everyone equal opportunity, which is a part of what we guarantee under the Constitution, requires interventions. And so if it's not going to be affirmative action as so named and defined, what might those interventions be? So I would say, I think there's plenty of conversation and debate to be had about the how, but engaging in the why we even had affirmative action in the first place, and is there still need for it? Absolutely.
Thank you, Anna. Let me maybe help shift gear to something that students are really interested in knowing. So we have a number of questions by students. One student asked, what advice do you have for upcoming scholars, current doctoral students, to better understand and be critical of racist practices in education and research? How do we resist traditional ideologies that perpetuate racial hierarchy within and outside of academia?
Great question, and one near and dear to my heart as somebody who's gone through this journey as a student and later as a professor and scholar. I think when we're looking at various disciplines, like people, when I was at University of Colorado, I would talk with groups throughout the campus. So let's take, for example, a physics department, and people would say, okay, in physics, we just focus on science. We're just doing science. It's very neutral. That's what we do. And of course, I'm being flippant because there's a lot more important complexity to the world of physics. But the question would be like, okay, well, who made the case books? What perspective did those authors bring? Which voices are not there? How did those sources of education and framing kind of frame the discipline and frame the entry point for other students? And back to my earlier point, when some students feel that they can't learn appropriately so from a professor who doesn't see them, who doesn't see their identity, who doesn't accept and value who they are. And that goes to the materials that professors choose to teach. So as somebody who's coming into that world as an educator, keeping a keen eye on what assumptions are built into whatever discipline you're in. Where did the assumptions come from? How can you disrupt the assumptions to offer a broader perspectives about what the discipline is? And here, just in my own discipline, the world of international law, it's everything from, there's this individual named Grotius back in the 16th century in Europe, who is considered to be the quote father or grandfather of international law, because he made certain important contributions. Did he make important contributions? Yes, absolutely. However, the other side of the story is that he was also involved in business, economic activity that involved the enslavement of peoples. And so it's important to put both of those stories together to appreciate, everybody that we're praising in a discipline historically. There's other parts of the history that we need to be aware of, and that's, I think, having an inclusive history and an inclusive theoretical framing of any discipline gets us to helping challenge these core assumptions in any particular discipline or field, that opens up education in a way that allows people from many backgrounds who have not traditionally defined and framed the field to be more a part of creating knowledge in those fields, and not just being having knowledge imparted upon them.
Thank you, Anna. So judging from your answers to the questions, I take it that when you talk about education, you're not just talking about higher education. And in fact, some of the questions that came in are precisely about education beyond the university. So elementary, middle, and high school, and an earlier question about community also brings to mind our university's sort of responsibility to engage with our community. So what do you think about anti-racist education in these other settings, elementary, middle school, and high school?
I appreciate the question because I'm a mom. I have two daughters who are in elementary school. And, it is a tough question of how to help the youth of the world understand that racism is real, that it continues to be harmful, and to empower them with the framework to question it, to fight back, to protect themselves, without traumatizing them in a way that's not good for their age. And here a real specific example. If you take in the United States, we celebrate Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. And it's usually a holiday, and there's usually school activities around that. And I remember, this moment where a teacher, well-intentioned, wanted to say, let's celebrate this, and we're going to celebrate the plight of African Americans and the struggle for civil rights in the United States. And it was well-intentioned, but it had the effect in the classroom of separating out the very few African American students or students of Black descent from other places who were called upon by their peers to say, oh, you are part of this group that was treated poorly, and we certainly don't want to do that going forward. And so I think, at a certain age where all you want is to blend in, all you want is to belong, all you want is to not be called out, having that dynamic is actually furthering some of the traumas that the very conversation about the civil rights movement was meant to avoid. So I think the short answer is there's no one model. We have to always be critical of our well-intentioned efforts to look at beyond intent to actual effect, to consider in those circumstances who has the power in the room, who's not a part of the conversation, who's not a part of designing and structuring the conversation. It's a hard question. And I think the younger people are, the harder it is. But I will say this other thing, that for many people, it is a privilege to learn about racism and other forms of discrimination through books and not in the world. And I think that's another piece of this, is that if we're going to undo racism, people always say, oh, it's the young people and they'll grow up and they won't be like we were or like our grandparents were. But if we're going to really get there, then we have to have more evidence about what actually changes behavior, what changes structures, what changes stories and families and norms and values, beyond merely telling people about the history. And America's not there yet. The world's not there yet. We have a lot more work to do.
And you're absolutely right. Sometimes we don't realize how privileged we are just to have books. And even though you said earlier in your talk that you cannot read your way to eliminate racism, but in some parts of the world, children don't even have books. They don't even have access to reading. So, which actually, it's taking us to some of the questions being asked precisely about inequalities. So I'm trying to combine these questions, but one question asked was, how does capitalism and its inherent inequalities undermine efforts to eliminate systemic racism? Someone in connection to that, another person asked, did economics power always play a role in racist politics? They're not exactly the same question, but they do bring up issues about power, economics, and inequalities.
It's good questions, and I feel that we have many experts and scholars in the audience and folks who've given this deep thought. So, capitalism, to start with that, there's different ways to define it and different ways to understand it, but it compares to other forms of governance. We might consider socialism, communism. We might consider so-called authoritarian forms of governance. We might consider monarchy. So there's oligarchy. There's other forms. So if we consider capitalism as a governance structure that's linked to both politics and economics, we can think about capitalism as being growth-oriented. We can think about also, not everybody would agree with this, but one of the values embedded in some capitalistic frames is this idea of meritocracy. Mm-hmm. The idea that if you only work hard and do your best and you are good at what you do, you will rise out of the circumstances, which might be poverty or racism or other or gender discrimination, et cetera, and you will achieve equality. If the pathway to equality is through hard work, meritocracy, that's been one of the stories that have been told. And capitalism, I think, upholds that narrative in a certain way. And yet we know meritocracy, to the extent that you think it even exists, is deeply flawed, just like anything, because it is all in who gets to judge what is good, what is better than the other. We know that people can work hard all day long, and some people are starting off in life and starting off in the world with barriers they themselves cannot remove, no matter how hard they work. And so I think a short answer to a very important and deeper question, it goes again to assumptions, and it goes again to what I had on the second to last slide, which is balancing power. Who gets to set up the structures? Why were the structures set up the way they were? Who are they designed to help? Who are they designed to keep on the bottom of the social hierarchy? How do we understand those frames and start to dismantle them when they are abhorrent to our common goals of equality, equity, dignity, and more? That's the conversation we need to be engaged in. And then anytime you're dismantling structures, there's winners and there's losers on all sides of that. That's why structures last. That's why those in power often like to keep the structures they have, because it serves them. And so, you know, there's a real commitment to the status quo, even at the UN level, because the status quo for many people is better, even as it's oppressing some, than getting rid of the status quo and having chaos or other forms of disruption. So that's a very rambling answer. It's an interesting question. I think, you know, economics go hand in hand with upholding forms of oppression. And over here somewhere in my bookcase, I have one of my favorite books, which is The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which gets into some of this from various perspectives. So more to be talked about. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Anna. And you're absolutely right about the structures being tools, intentionally or not, that uphold hierarchies, right? You know, you think about SAT, and some people do better in SAT and some people don't. All right, so Anna, I know that your talk and your conversation today represents sort of your view as a scholar, and not necessarily representing sort of UCLA's official view or view of the your office. But people are dying to ask you questions about what UCLA are doing. So
Okay.
I feel that I will have to take this question and ask you, what is UCLA doing to promote anti-racism and anti-Semitism for the 2021 academic year and the future?
Okay, well, I cannot speak to all that UCLA is or is not doing, but I can tell you how I'm thinking about it, both in individual capacity and how my office, the Office of Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, is thinking about it. We are currently engaged in conversations inside the office and with our core partners, including our wonderful Student Advisory Board and our fantastic members of our Equity Advising Program that's spread out throughout the campus, about what our priorities can be for 2021. We are not a huge office. We have a lot of responsibilities that we have to do by law in terms of investigations for civil rights violations, and we have limited resources. But it's very important to start conversations that are going to achieve change. In other words, I know, because I've talked and listened to many different groups on UCLA, that there's a sense of frustration that there's been assessments and data has been gathered and people have studied the problem. When is action coming? And so, you know, I would put the question back out to the community here at UCLA and all you know, others, to say, if you had a magic wand and you had all the resources you needed and you could make the decision, what are the 2 or 3 things you think are possible? And why would you prioritize those 2 or 3 things? For me, when it goes to questions of racism in particular, it goes to one particular space. Who has power? Lots of groups have power. It's not just the administrative leadership. It's not just the academic senate. Students have power when students go out and raise their voices and gather and send signals that certain things are vital. Other groups have power too. So how do we move from power into dialogue? Dialogue means we understand there's a problem, we disagree about how to proceed, because proceeding means certain things have to take priority, and we disagree about the priorities and the resources. So not everything is always possible. So I think systemic racism and other forms of racism are very important to me to look at UCLA and to see what is evidence-based that's going to actually create meaningful change and authentic change. Some of it's policy, some of it's structural, some of it's people. You know, who are the people in the room that make the decision? Are the people aware? You know, and that gets back to what I said in the remarks, that sometimes it's because people are not aware, and sometimes they are aware. So there's a lot of conversations to be had about racism. I just want to turn quickly to one other important question I see in the chat. Somebody's talking about mentioning the role of hierarchies and dehumanization and racism. Do you think it's important to include our relationship with non-humans? Absolutely. Because in the grand hierarchy of humans, we often put everything else underneath us. And if we are going to move into a value in the world of seeing each other and treating each other with dignity, embracing equality and deeper equity, we can't continue to have opposite values towards the earth and towards all the other forms of life on our planet. We are one planet, and we will succeed or not together. And so, you know, what you wouldn't know from my background is I started my career as an environmentalist. I worked at the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and participated in the climate change round that was Conference of the Parties 6, which probably dates me, which is to say, you know, humanity will survive because the earth does. And the earth might survive without us if we don't get on board with the earth. So I think these conversations that we're having about people extend way beyond, and I find that to be very valuable.
Thank you, Anna. I know that we're running out of time, but if it's okay with you, I'd like to ask the one final question, because you talked about, you know, the future, we talked about power, that everyone really has power to try to dismantle racism. So one of the questions that was asked is from someone who just graduated from UCLA. And she said, I just graduated from UCLA this past June, and I wonder how I can continue to question racism outside of an academic environment. I'm aware that racism affects us even after graduation, but sometimes I feel that I have lost access to spaces to discuss or effect positive change on issues of racism after graduating. So what is your advice, Anna, to this new alumna of us?
First of all, congratulations. Once a Bruin, always a Bruin, and we hope you'll stay a part of the UCLA family. Your question's an excellent one. We cannot address racism or educate ourselves or change our own minds and behaviors alone. And so finding people that you can develop rapport and trust with and communications with, and having conversations about the challenges, acknowledging your own, the things that where you get stuck, and finding a person you can talk through those things with is important. I think none of us are immune from bias. None of us are immune from the call towards feeling superior with a hierarchy according to whatever it is. And it's important for all of us to do the work we can with ourselves, with our friends, with our family. As somebody who is I am in my parents, my grandparents, my hundreds of cousins, my family is multiracial. We are multinational in multiple countries around the world, and not all of us see things the same way. And so, as you know, I have had those moments with family members where you say, how could you believe that? And because they're family, because you can't kick them out your house at Thanksgiving, you know, you get into it with them, and you say, you go into the conversation, and you realize somewhere along there that it all comes back to people want to matter themselves. People want to feel like they are important in the world. And the turn where we go wrong is when my being important requires somebody else not to be important. And that, I think, is the core that dignity is trying to undo. One of the definitions of dignity is seeing value in the other as being neither better nor worse than yourself, even when you have different roles. And so I guess I just want to conclude with that thought, that to me, the organizing principle is finding places that we can embrace dignity and enact dignity in our behavior in the world, because where there's dignity, we get away from discrimination, racism, and other harms. So the two are very connected. And I think it's a positive way to look forward, that every single one of us wants to be treated with dignity, and we all deserve to be treated with dignity.
Thank you, Anna. I wish we could have you for another 2 hours, but to be continued. But I really want to thank you for giving your talk and entertaining these questions, very important questions, and good luck with your book. And thank you once again for being our speaker today. And I also want to thank everyone in the audience for joining us during this webinar and during International Education Week. And I hope you participate in the many other IEW events during the rest of the week. Thank you again. Have a wonderful evening, morning, and afternoon. Goodbye.